When we look at scaling, the question is, how do we get bigger? And that's kind of the theme of this lecture. It's really long. You can judge for yourself what's useful and what isn't. But what it kind of comes down to is scaling is a big topic. Uh, Instagram, for example. Instagram, 30 million customers, serviced by 13 people. Kevin Systrom really knew what he was doing. That in the digital space, you don't need that many people to service people. What about Apple? Are they going to become the first trillion-dollar company? Are they scaling that big? 266 billion in revenue and $890 billion valuation. Of course, valuation goes up and down with stock price. It's pretty flirty. When we look at the history of companies that have grown, the oil companies and GM for the longest time were considered to be the biggest companies, and then they got dethroned by Walmart. Actually, Walmart has about $445 billion in revenue, so they really beat the tar out of Apple, and yet their valuation is more in the $250 billion range. And the reason why is they don't have growth prospects. The thing about Apple is they used to be growing at 30%, now they're growing at 15%. You get so big, it's just so hard to, to add on business. Is it possible to get infinite growth? Well, you look for analogs in nature and what they do. The life on Earth that has infinite growth right now are basically like sequoia trees. And what do? They trim themselves. So what happens is their focus is on growth, and they get rid of all the dead and lower branches, and they just keep going and going and going. And so the question is can a company do that? Uh, can you start removing things to make yourself lean and to continue to grow? In terms of scale, these are the kinds of things that you're concerned with, whether it's capacity, resources. How far can my market go? And is it transferable? These are the questions you have to be ready to ask. When you look at how a company scales up, first it starts out with you and maybe another couple of other people, and you're pretty much going it alone. And then what happens is that now it's time for you to go out and you raise some money, and now it's time for you to go out and hire people. And then you have trust issues. It's hard to transition and start giving up things for other people to work on. Then you become more of a hybrid company. You start outsourcing. Chaos ensues because you're letting things away. And what you hope for, though, is that you start getting positive feedback on your products. You get a network effect. Now, it's around here that you could have bad problems or you could have good problems. The bad problems are you're not getting enough traction. You have sales. You could have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of sales. But you're not earning enough to pay everyone. And you're not earning enough to definitely turn a profit. And so the question is do you conserve your cash and try to find a way forward through marketing or whatever? Or do I invest in my company? And this is where I have good problems, and that's that I'm growing so rapidly and all. The question is, can I keep pace? And so it's an issue of if I spend money, can I make money? And this is where you're going over growing pains. And so corporations, you're no longer a startup. And so you need structure, you need processes, and you need to start thinking about how do I want to harvest and get out of here. And so through all this whole growth curve, it's about time and money. Now, before I talked about the three pillars, that anytime you need to think about a company and make it simple on yourself, think of three pillars. You're about your executive strategy, you're about marketing, you're about product development. And so all of this has to scale. And so what it comes down to is first I think about my three pillars. For my three pillars, now I have to see how do those three pillars translate into a business model. That business model, how am I going to go execute it? Who are the tools and people that are going to make this happen? And that's your strategy. And finally, profit. Can I make a profit? And in order to make a profit and to keep growing with a profit, what do I need? I need to understand my pricing, and I need to run lean. Many startups were basically pigs and went belly up. When we look at the crux of execution, what it starts out with is, what do I want to become? What's my vision and ambition? And then the management, I figure out partners and suppliers, standardization. Is one plant going to be like another plant? And so we see from something like McDonald's how important that is. What's my secret sauce, and what is competition doing? What really comes down to is, now I need to convert from being this creative growth kind of company to being more disciplined. And that's developing a Six Sigma mindset, or DMAIC, meaning what's my spec, how do I define it, how do I measure it, how do I analyze it, how do I improve, and how am I going to go get control. The crux of education is, how do I get to the me? How can I find enough markets where I can sell into? Then we have conflict. If I don't have enough capacity to meet demand, I'm going to lose business. It gives an opportunity for my competitors to come in, and I've underinvested in my business. However, if I overspend on my business, then I burn up all my cash, and I was growing way too fast. This happens to a lot of companies in Silicon Valley, and that's like, they think, oh, we're ready, and then they start breaking ground on things, and they don't even have a product. And so that ends up killing them. And so, do I overspend or do I lose business? And that's one of the big conflicts in it. But what it comes down to is, what is my vision? And my vision ultimately translates into a strategy. My vision gives way to what my mission is, which pushes me towards who is going to be that leader. I have to put together a structure for the company and the processes that will go ahead and drive it. Now, what's your product actually going to be? You're either going to be in the service business, or you're going to be in the products business. We're actually making things. The thing about services that's so tough is that demand goes up and down. Now, I only have so much capacity. There's my constant core capacity of what I'm going to be able to get out of my people. Then there's a stretch. What if I have business above my core capacity and I've got a shortfall? Well, what I do is, what the stretch is I tell my people, okay, you all need to work longer hours and basically just squeeze more out of the people that I already have. The problem is, you can still have a shortfall. So what do I do about that shortfall? Do I turn away business? And so I need to think about my variable resources. Are there consultants or somebody I can bring on in the short term to basically cover the work? And what's that all about? ROI. And that's, if I hire these people, am I going to make money? Products, as demand shoots up, you have your constant capacity of what you can do. The whole trick about products is, you're never going to get 100% utilization of your equipment in your line. What's going to happen is, you're going to have time. You're going to have leaner times where you don't have to make as much, and times where you need more than what your capacity can create. And so you have waste in your line, underutilization. In the semiconductor business, you could have parts of your line operating at 40% utilization and other parts operating at 90%. It happens, but it's wasted cost. So how do you streamline this to make it as efficient as possible? And so if you need more capacity, though, adding capacity is expensive. It's typically because they want you to add things in big blocks, and those big blocks are not cheap. And so the question is when you hit that need, are you going to grow too quickly, or are you going to go under? It's your choice. So from the product side of view, a lot of it is about forecasting, guessing how much you actually need. So before I start diving in more into scaling, I'm going to talk about production, some of the rules of production. And that's that, supposing I have a bunch of differently timed steps in production. And so from step 1 to step 2, it's an hour, 2 hours, an hour and a half. And so how do I determine what my production time is? Well, and some of you may have already had an operations class and know this, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But what it comes down to is that the longest path is your limiting path. And that's when you sit down and think about it. My first step is only an hour. My next step is 2 hours. So, well, this is going through that 2 hour step. My 1 hour ones just keep coming. And so it's your number of steps times the longest step. That's what your actual throughput is. Yes, one pass through this is only 4.5 hours, but your throughput is only 8. That's why you're always trying to do things in as small steps as possible. That's why assembly lines work. Uh, Anytime you add a magnitude to your scale, you need a new level of discipline. Now, that's not necessarily true for software, but it is true for physical products. And so, say I want to make 1 million of something. What that really means is that I need to have 2 of these coming off the line every minute in order to make 1 million a year. Uh, Realistically, though, you can actually do better, but you have to start looking at yield and labor and that sort of thing. In terms of the general rule of thumb with people, we have limits. We're only so strong. We can only endure so much. We have errors. And so if I look at the quantity of production, and when I start thinking about people and tools, this is what it's about. Asking one person to produce 100 of something is definitely possible. It's a lot of work for them. They have to sweat it out. But when you're talking about that kind of range in your quantity, that's what you're referring to. When you start going up to 100,000, you can still do it with people. You don't need full automation, but you are going to need certain tools to do it. And so you can get away with an assembly line. Now, if you're going to go from over 100,000, now you're talking about you need good manufacturing processes, and you're going to need some level of automation in there somewhere in order to output enough. So the number one selling car in the world is the Toyota Corolla. 1.2 million of them are produced every year. However, when they manufacture these, you would think, okay, 1.2 million. Well, that means that I should be doing it purely by automation, and that's not true. And the reason why is the Toyota Corolla is made in 16 different plants around the world. So guess what? They're above 100, under 100,000, and that's why they can still get away with the assembly line. Here's some interesting statistics about the error rate of human beings and different things that they do. This is actually from my data-driven decision-making class, which is going to be held in the fall. I'll have a posting about it, but if some of you are still around and want to take a course, it's pretty interesting. I think it's online during the B session. The way to think about people is they're going to yield about 95%. And if you want to do above that, you're going to need automation. And where that comes from is essentially how often they fail, how many tasks they can do. And so if you have a 0.001 fail rate, so that means 0.999, 0.999, 0.999, all multiplied together. And so 48 consecutive tasks. The error rate's 95.3. On the other hand, you look at a robot that can perform at a Six Sigma level, and all of a sudden, now you're talking about 99.9%. That's why robots are better than people. To get a feel of what production really is, during World War II, think about a big bomber aircraft. We used to make, we produced 84,853 of these things. We used to pump one off the line every 6 minutes. We were making airplanes faster than they can shoot them down. To put it in perspective, our military today has about 3,000 aircraft. So that's when we could really make things. One of the conundrums in scaling up is, do I want to go for scale or scope? And the way you can think of economies of scale, and that's that if I make a lot of them, I make it a lot cheaper. If you wanted to buy a $15,000 car and decided not to buy it at economies of scale, but like buy spare parts and make it yourself, it would cost you $125,000. That's the impact, economies of scale. Economies of scope means that using the same equipment, I could do different products. Like if I have an injection molded printer, I can make toys or I can make medical products. In terms of economies of scale, some examples are batch processes, and that's that every time I run through the entire process, I create a certain volume. And so, as you can see here, some statistics from the semiconductor industry, very profitable. Another way I can get economies of scale is um, instead of doing things in batch, I can do things through high throughput, and that's like plastics. And I watched some injection molding plastic. It's just amazing if you've never seen one of those machines. I mean, they just turn it on, and next thing you know, within like 10 or 15 minutes, the parts start coming out like chiclets. I mean, it just cascades out. So how a semiconductor, a batch process? Well, a typical lot has about 25 wafers, and so one silicon wafer has 314 devices. Um, and so when you do an entire run, one wafer versus 25 wafers doesn't matter. The cost is the same. And that's what we mean by batch, that we can run 25 wafers at once. So you can actually go to websites like DigiKey and see where you get price breaks with volume. But when you sit down and look at it, it pretty much jumps on orders of magnitude. And so you need to think about what are your jump points. And meaning, when I say buckets, what markets are you going to fill? What's the key for you getting critical mass? And when we look at economies of scale, low volume is very challenging. And the reason why low volume is challenging is that you have so much money in setup costs. Again, the difference between one wafer versus 25 is about the same, because we're all running the same boats. You can kind of think about it like filling up airplanes. And so the one thing about low volumes is that, being that there's so many vendors in the world, some of that impact has been softened, but you still get caught in that conundrum. And so in terms of economies of scope, yes, you can get more personalized products. However, the really hard thing in you as a business is when you have to turn the line over and the machine over. All of a sudden you lose yield because you're doing different things. And not only that, but there's all the personnel and training that have to support it. The next big issue in terms of scaling is determining, should I make it myself, the quantity of my product to keep up, or do I need to go out and buy it? And these are the things that you have to take into consideration. One thing about outsourcing it is you can raise capability, meaning they might be able to do things that you can't. But it impacts speed, your upfront capital. How much money do I need to spend for this? And then I have to be concerned about, if I outsource this, I'm losing also control of my quality. And am I going to be able to support my customer? These are the things that you need to think about. In terms of the economics of scaling, there's something called, some call it the trough of sorrow. It's just the trough. And that's that when you look at your spending, what happens? As you build more of something, your costs go up, your profit goes down, and then you reach a point where you turn it around to reach break even. But all that area where you're losing money, that's called the trough. And the question is how can I make that as skinny as possible and not as deep? And this is where time to cash, your lifetime value of your customer, your cost of customer acquisition all start kicking in. And the width of my trough is dedicated to my scaling. Now, when I do make versus buy, the process you follow is, first you have to run the numbers. See, is this going to be profitable? Then I have to start thinking, after I do the quantitative stuff, then I need to do the qualitative stuff. I start thinking about my strategy and everything else. And you could have rules, like for example in the biomedical business, if we got sales up to 100 million, then we took it away from the vendors and brought it in-house. Or maybe you just want to protect your secret sauce. The thing about scaling is it's heavily industry dependent, and that's why it's a really hard topic to lecture on. And so I'm going to be discussing a lot of this in broad strokes. And in the next lecture, I'll talk about